History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2, The First Civilizations. Chapter 5, The Beginnings of Civilizations in Eastern Asia. These developments took a long time. The steps by which the original Vedic tradition began its transformation into classical Hinduism are obscure and complicated. At the center of the early evolution had been the Brahmins who long controlled religious thought because of their key role in the sacrificial rites of Vedic religion. The Brahmanical class appears to have used its religious authority to emphasize its seclusion and privilege. To kill a Brahman soon became the gravest of crimes. Even kings could not contend with their powers. Yet they seem to have come to terms with the gods of an older world in early times. It had been suggested that it may have been the infiltration of the Brahmanical class of priests of the non Aryan cults, which ensured the survival and later popularity of the cult of Shiva. The sacred Upanishads, texts dating from about 700 BC, mark the next important evolution towards a more philosophical religion. They are a mixed bag of about 250 devotional utterances, hymns, aphorisms, and reflections of holy men pointing to the inner meaning of the traditional religious truths. They give much less emphasis to personal gods and goddesses than earlier texts, and also include some of the earliest ascetic teachings which were to be so visible and striking a feature of Indian religion, even if only practiced by a small minority. The Upanishads met the need felt by some men to look outside the traditional structure for religious satisfaction. Doubts appears to have been felt about the sacrificial principle. New patterns of thought had begun to appear at the beginning of the historical period, and uncertainty about traditional beliefs is already expressed in the later hymns of Rig Veda. It is convenient to mention such developments here because they cannot be understood apart from the Aryan and pre Aryan past. Classical Hinduism was to embody a synthesis of ideas like those in the Upanishads, pointing to a monotheistic conception of the universe, with the more polytheistic popular tradition represented by the Brahmins. Abstract speculation and asceticism were often favored by the existence of monasticism, a stepping aside from material concerns to practice devotion and contemplation. The practice appeared in Vedic times. Some monks threw themselves into ascetic experiment. Others pressed speculation very far, and we have records of intellectual systems which rested on outright determinism and materialism. One very successful cult which did not require belief in gods and expressed a reaction against the formalism of the Brahmanical religion was Jainism, a creation of a 6th century teacher who, among other things, preached a respect for animal life and made agriculture or animal husbandry impossible. Jains therefore tended to become merchants, with the result that in modern times the Jain community is one of the wealthiest in India. But much the important of innovating systems was the teaching of the Buddha, the enlightened one or aware one, as his name may be translated. It has been thought significant that Buddha, like some other religious innovators, was born in one of the states to the northern edge of the Ganges plain, where the orthodox monarchical pattern emerging elsewhere did not establish itself. This was early in the 6th century BC. Siddhartha Gautama was not a Brahman, but a prince of the warrior class. After a comfortable and gentlemanly upbringing, he found his life unsatisfying and left home. His first recourse was asceticism. 7 years of this proved to him that he was on the wrong road. he began instead to preach and teach. His reflections led him to profound, austere, and ethical doctrine, whose aim was liberation from suffering by achieving higher states of consciousness. This was not without parallels in teachings of the Upanishads. An important part in this was to be played by yoga, which was to become one of what were termed the six systems of Hindu philosophy. The word has many meanings, but in this context is roughly translatable as method or technique. It sought to achieve truth through meditation after a complete and perfect control of the body had been attained. Such control was supposed to reveal the illusion of personality, which, like all else in the created world, is mere flux, the passage of events, not identity. This system too had already been sketched in the Upanishads and was to become one of the aspects of Indian religion which struck visitors from Europe most forcibly. The Buddha taught his disciples so to discipline and shed the demands of the flesh, that no obstacle should prevent the soul from attaining the blessed state of nirvana or self annihilation, freedom from the endless cycle of rebirth and transmigration. A doctrine urging men not to do something but to be something, in order not to be anything. The way to achieve this was to follow an eightfold path of moral and spiritual improvement. All this amounts to a great ethical and humanitarian revolution. The Buddha apparently had great practical and organizing ability. Together with his unquestionable personal quality, it must have helped to make him a popular and successful teacher. He sidestepped rather than opposed the Brahmanical religion, and this must have smoothed his path. The appearance of communities of Buddhist monks gave his work an institutional form which would outlive him. He also offered a role to those not satisfied by traditional practice, in particular to women and to low caste followers, for caste was irrelevant in his eyes. Finally, Buddhism was non ritualistic, simple, and atheistic. It soon underwent elaboration and, some would say, speculative contamination, and like all other great religions, it assimilated much pre existing belief and practice, but by doing so, it retained great popularity. Yet, Buddhism did not supplant Brahmanical religion and for 2 centuries or so was confined to a relatively small part of the Ganges Valley. In the end, too, though not until well into the Christian era, Hinduism was to be the victor and Buddhism would dwindle to a minority belief in India. But it was to become the most widespread religion in Asia and a potent force in world history. It is the first world religion to spread beyond the society in which it was born, for the older tradition of Israel had to wait for the Christian era before it could assume a world role. In its native India, Buddhism was to be important until the coming of Islam. The teachings of Buddha marks, therefore, a recognizable epoch in Indian history. It justifies a break in its exposition. By his day, an Indian civilization still living today and still capable of enormous assimilative feats stood complete in its essentials. This was a huge fact. It would separate India from the rest of the world. Much of the achievement of early civilization in India remains intangible. There is a famous figure of a beautiful dancing girl from Mohenjo-daro, but ancient India before the Buddha's time did not produce great art on the scale of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Minoan Crete. Far less their great monuments. Marginal in its technology, India came late, though how much later than other civilization cannot be exactly said. To literacy too. Yet the uncertainties of much of India's early history cannot obscure the fact that its social system and religions have lasted longer than any other great creations of the human mind. Even to guess at what influence they exercised through the attitudes they encouraged, diffused through centuries in pure or impure forms, is rash. Only a negative dogmatism is safe, so comprehending a set of worldviews, institutions so careless of the individual, philosophy so assertive of the relentless cycles of being, so lacking in any easy ascription of responsibility for good and evil, cannot have made a history very different from that of men reared in the great Semitic traditions. And these attitudes were formed and settled for the most part of 1,000 years before Christ. Ancient China. The most striking fact of China's history is that it has gone on for so long. For about 2,500 years, there has been a Chinese nation using a Chinese language. Its government, at least in name, as a single unit has long been taken to be normal in spite of periods of grievous division and confusion. China has had a continuing experience of civilization, rivaled in duration only by the ancient Egypt, and this is the key to Chinese historical identity. China's nationhood is as much cultural as political. The example of India shows how much more important culture can be than government, and China makes the same point in a different way. There, culture made unified government easier. Somehow, at a very early date, it crystallized certain institutions and attitudes which were to endure because this suited its circumstances. Some of them seem then even to transcend the revolution of the 20th century. We begin with the land itself, and at first sight, it does not suggest much that makes for unity. The physical theater of China history is vast. China is bigger than the United States and now contains 5 times as many people. The Great Wall, which came to guard the northern frontier, was in the end made up of between 2,500 to 3,000 miles of fortifications and has never been completely surveyed. From Peking to Hong Kong, more or less due south, is 1,200 miles as the crow flies. This huge expanse contains many climates and many regions. Above all, northern and southern China are very different. In summer, the north is scorching and arid, while the south is humid and used to floods. The north looks bare and dust blown in the winter, while the south is always green. One of the major themes of early Chinese history is of the spread of civilization, sometimes by migration, sometimes by diffusion, from north to south, of the tendency of conquest and political unification to take the same broad direction, and of the continual stimulation and irrigation of the northern civilization by currents from the outside from Mongolia and Central Asia. China's major internal divisions are set by mountains and rivers. Three great river valleys drain the interior and run across the country, roughly from west to east. They are, from north to south, the Huanghe or Yellow River, the Yangtze, and the Qi. It is surprising that a country so vast and thus divided should form a unity at all. Yet China is isolated too, a world by itself since long before the Pleistocene. Much of China is mountainous, and except in the extreme south and northeast, her frontiers still sprawl across and along great ranges and plateaus. The headwaters of the Yangtze, like those of the Mekong, lie in the high Kunlun north of Tibet. These highland frontiers are great isolators. The arc they form is broken only where the Yellow River flows south into China from the inner Mongolia, and it is on the banks of this river that the story of civilization in China begins. Skirting the Desert, itself, separated by another mountain range from the desolate wastes of the Gobi, the Yellow River opens a sort of funnel into North China. Through it have flown people and soil. The lowest beds of the river valley, easily worked and fertile, laid down by wind from the north, are the basis of the first Chinese agriculture. Once this region was richly forested and well watered, but it became colder and more desiccated in one of those climatic transformations which are behind so much primeval social change. The Chinese prehistory overall, of course, there is a bigger setting than one river valley. Peking man, a version of Homo erectus, turns up as a fire user about 600,000 years ago, and there are Neanderthal traces in all three of the great river basins. The trail from these forerunners to the dimly discernible cultures, which are their successors in early Neolithic times, leads us to a China already divided into two cultural zones, with a meeting place and mixing area on the Yellow River. It is impossible to separate the tangle of cultural interconnections already detectable by that time. But there was no even progress towards a uniform or united culture. Even in early historical times, we are told, the whole of China was teeming with Neolithic survivals. Against this varied background emerged settled agriculture. Nomads and settlers were to coexist in China until our own day. Rhinoceros and elephant were still hunted in the north not long before 1000 BC. As in other parts of the world, the coming of agriculture meant a revolution. It has been argued that peoples who lived in the semi tropical coastal areas of Southeast Asia and South China were clearing forests to make fields as far back as 10,000 BC. Certainly, they exploited vegetation to provide themselves with fibers and food. But this is still a topic about which much more needs to be known. Rice was being farmed along the Yangtze in the 7th millennium BC, and ground just above the flood level of the Yellow River begins to yield evidence of agriculture, probably the growing of millet, from about 5800 BC. Somewhat like that of early Egypt, the first Chinese agriculture seems to have been exhaustive or semi exhaustive. The land was cleared, used for a few years, and then left to revert to nature, while the cultivators turned attention elsewhere. From what has been called the nuclear area of North China, agriculture can be seen later to spread both north to Manchuria and to the south. Within it, there soon appeared complex cultures which combined with agriculture the use of jade and wood for carving, the domestication of silkworms, the making of ceremonial vessels in forms which were to become traditional, and perhaps even the use of chopsticks. In other words, this was in Neolithic times already the home of much that is characteristic of the later Chinese tradition in the historic area. Ancient writers recognized the importance of this revolutionary social change, and legends identified a specific inventor of agriculture. Yet, very little can be inferred confidently or clearly about social organization at this stage. Perhaps because of this, there has been a persistent tendency among Chinese to idealize it. Long after private property had become widespread, it was assumed that under heaven every spot is the sovereign's ground, and this may reflect early ideas that all land belonged to the community as a whole. Chinese Marxists later upheld this tradition, discerning in the archaeological evidence a golden age of primitive communism preceding a descent into slave and feudal society. argument is unlikely to convince those interested in the question one way or the other. Ground seems to be firmer in attributing to these times the appearance of a clan structure and totems, prohibitions on marriage within the clan. Kinship in this form is almost the first institution which can be seen to have survived to be important in historical times. The evidence of the pottery, too, suggests some new complexity in social roles. Already, things were being made which cannot have been intended for the rough and tumble of everyday use. A stratified society seems to be emerging before we reach the historical era. One material sign of a future China, already obvious at this stage, is the widespread use of millet, a grain well adapted to the sometimes arid farming of the north. It was to be the basic staple of Chinese diet until about 1,000 years ago and sustained a society which, in due course, arrived at literacy, at a great art of bronze casting based on a difficult and advanced technology, at the means of making exquisite pottery far finer than anything made anywhere else in the world, and, above all, at an ordered political and social system which identifies the first major age of Chinese history. But it must be remembered once more that the agriculture which made this possible was for a long time confined to North China, and the many parts of this huge country only took up farming when historical times had already begun. The narrative of early times is very hard to recover, but can be outlined with some confidence. It has been agreed that the story of civilization in China begins under rulers from a people called the Shang, the first name with independent evidence to support it in the traditional list of dynasties, which was for a long time the basis of Chinese chronology. From the late 8th century BC, we have better dates, but we still have no chronology for early Chinese history as well founded as, say, that of Egypt. It is more certain that somewhere about 1700 BC and a century each way is an acceptable margin of approximation. A tribe called Shang, which enjoyed the military advantage of the chariot, imposed itself on its neighbors over a sizable stretch of the Yellow River Valley. Eventually, the Shang domain was a matter of about 40,000 square miles in northern Honan. This made it somewhat smaller than modern England, though its cultural influences reached far beyond its periphery, as evidenced from as far away as South China, Chinese, Turkestan, and the northeastern coast shows. Shang kings lived and died in some state. Slaves and human sacrificial victims were buried with them in deep and lavish tombs. Their courts had archivists and scribes, for this was the first truly literate culture east of Mesopotamia. This is one reason for distinguishing between Shang civilization and Shang dynastic paramountcy. This people showed a cultural influence which certainly extended far beyond any area they could have dominated politically. The political arrangements of the Shang domains themselves seem to have depended on the uniting of landholding with obligations to the king. The warrior landlords, who were the key figures, were the leading members of aristocratic lineages with semi mythical origins. Yet, Shang government was advanced enough to use scribes and had a standardized currency. What it could do when at full stretch is shown in its ability to mobilize large amounts of labor for the building of fortifications and cities. Shang China succumbed in the end to another tribe from the west of the valley, the Chao. A probable date is between 1150 and 1120 BC. Under the Chao, Many the already elaborate governmental and social structures inherited from the Shang were preserved and further refined. Burial rites, bronze working techniques, and decorative art also survived in hardly altered forms. The great work of the Chao period was the consolidation and diffusion of this heritage. In it can be discerned the hardening of the institutions of a future imperial China which would last 2000 years. The Chao thought of themselves as surrounded by barbarian people, waiting for the benevolent effects of Chao tranquilization, an idea, it may be remarked, which still underlay the persistent refusal of Chinese officials 2000 years later to regard diplomatic missions from Europe as anything but respectful bearers of tribute. Chao supremacy, in fact, rested on war, but from it flowed great cultural consequences. As under the Shang, there was no truly unitary state, and Chao government represented a change of degree rather than kind. It was usually a matter of a group of notables and vassals, some more dependent on the dynasty than others, offering in good times at least a formal acknowledgement of its supremacy and all increasingly sharing in a common culture. Political China, if it is reasonable to use such a term, rested upon big estates which had sufficient cohesion to have powers of long survival, and in this process, their original lords turned into rulers who could be called kings, served by elementary bureaucracies. This system collapsed from about 700 BC when a barbarian incursion drove the Chao from their ancestral center to a new home further east in Hunan. The dynasty did not end until 256 BC, but the next distinguishable epoch dates from 403 to 221 BC, which is significantly known as the period of the warring states. In it, historical selection by conflict grew fierce. Big fish ate little fish until one only was left, and all the lands of the Chinese were, for the first time, ruled by one great empire, the Qin, from which the country was to get its name. This is matter for discussion elsewhere. Here, it is enough to register an epoch of Chinese history. Reading about these events in the traditional Chinese historical accounts can produce a slight feeling of beating the air, and historians who are not experts in Chinese studies may be forgiven if they cannot trace over this period of some 1500 years or so any helpful narrative thread in the dimly discernible struggles of kings and over mighty subjects. Indeed, scholars have not yet provided one. Nevertheless, two basic processes were going on for the most of this time, which were very important for the future and which give the period some unity, though their detail is elusive. The first of these was a continuing diffusion of culture to outwards from the Yellow Sea basin. To begin with, Chinese civilization was a matter of tiny islands in the sea of barbarism. Yet by 500 BC, it was the common possession of scores, perhaps hundreds, of what have been termed states, scattered across the north, and it had also been carried into the Yangtze Valley. This had long been a swampy, heavily forested region, very different from the north and inhabited by far more primitive people. Chao influence, in part thanks to the military expansion, irradiated this area and helped to produce the first major culture and state of the Yangtze Valley, the Chu civilization. Although owing much to the Chao, It had many distinctive linguistic, calligraphic, artistic, and religious traits of its own. By the end of this period of warring states, we have reached the point at which the stage of Chinese history is about to be much enlarged. The second of these fundamental and continuing processes under both Shang and Chao was establishment of landmarks in institutions which were to survive until the modern times. Among them was a fundamental division of Chinese society into a land owning nobility and the common people. Most of these were peasants, making up the vast majority of the population and paying for all that China produced in the way of civilization and state power. What little we know of their countless lives can be quickly said. Even less can be discovered than about the enormous masses of toilers at the base of every other ancient civilization. There is one good physical reason for this. The life of the Chinese peasant was an alternation between his mud hovel in the winter and an encampment where he lived during the summer months to guard and tend his growing crops. Neither has left much trace. For the rest, he appears sunk in the anonymity of his community. He does not belong to a clan. Tied to the soil, occasionally taken from it to carry out other duties and to serve his lord in war and hunting. His depressed state is expressed by the classification of Chinese communist historiography, which lumped Shang and Chao together as slavery society, preceding the feudal society which comes next.